Welcome to the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival. I'm delighted to introduce wildlife biologist and author Jonathan Slaght in conversation with Julia Wheeler.
Hello, and let me add my welcome to the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival. Thank you for being here. Today you are going to have to wrap up warm on the journey that we are going on with John Slaght, because we are off to hear all about his Owls of the Ice. John, you're joining us actually from Minnesota. I don't know how icy it is there today compared to the Russian Far East.
Well, hi, Julia. Thanks for talking to me. It's actually a pretty mild day today in Minnesota. Typically, it's quite cold here, but we're probably a good 5 degrees above average this winter so far. So it's icy, but it's not too cold.
I'd like to start, John, with the very first line of your book, if I may. I saw my first Blakiston's Fishelle in the Russian province of Primorye, a coastal talon of land hooking south into the belly of Northeast Asia. A coastal talon of land hooking south into the belly of Northeast Asia. I knew from the very first line that this was going to be a wonderful book and that we're in fantastic company. Congratulations on it.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's funny. So I've always looked at Primorye as a bird person, as a talon. And I was just reading, it was either Peter Matheson or John Valiant in one of their books about the tiger, where they call it a tiger claw, because they view it through the lens of a large mammal. But for me, it's a talon.
Let me just talk to you a little bit about the writing, because you've come to this whole subject from an academic point of view. And academic writing is let's say, different, not necessarily compelling. It does, it sets out to have different objectives. How easy or difficult did you find it to move across from that academic writing into something as lyrical as the book that you've produced?
Well, for me, it's always the two styles of writing have always been intertwined, because I'm required to write grants to fund the work. And if I use only dry academic language to try to entice donors, to draw them into a project, to a species, to a region, you're not going to get anywhere. So I learned very early on in my career as a scientist that you have to use two different styles of language depending on who you're talking to. And getting the donors invested in a place or a species is absolutely essential. So it wasn't that hard for me to write a book about this, because I'm accustomed to writing grant proposals for this work.
Take us to this region, how you first found it, how you became really obsessed in some ways by it and the owls that you were to find there.
Yeah, so my first trip there was really almost by chance. My father was a U.S. diplomat working at the U.S. embassy in Moscow, and a U.S. consulate had just opened in Vladivostok. The other side of the world, as far as I was concerned. It's 7-hour time difference, I believe, from Moscow, and it's almost, Vladivostok is almost as far away from Moscow as New York City. So it's other side of the world. And my father had some business there. So he said, "Hey, do you want to join me? You can stay with the host family for a few weeks." It was the summer. I had nothing to do. Okay, sure. And just flying in, looking down at this wild, uninhabited landscape just caught my attention immediately. And then spending time there on the ground, seeing the city of Vladivostok, which at the time, and this was 1995, almost seemed like it was the late 1970s. It was just almost like a step back in time. And then going out to some of these villages outside of the city, it was like going back to the mid 20th century. It was just a fascinating place. And then just the nature and the birds and the opportunity to explore and find new things was just intoxicating.
And where and when did you first discover that fish owls were the thing that you were to dedicate so much of your career to?
Yeah, well, I first heard about them actually. The host family I stayed with in 1995, they gifted me a book of Soviet birds of the region, and that was where I first read about the Fishelle. I never, my Russian was rudimentary. I speak Russian fluently now. My Russian was rudimentary then, but rybny filin, fish, owl, were words that I knew. And it was just like, what is that? Like, there's an owl that eats fish. So for years, I just had this, it was this sort of mythical creature living in my mind. And I was in the Peace Corps in Primoria in the late 1990s and into 2001. And that's when I first saw one. And I wasn't expecting to see one. I considered it mythical. I never thought I'd actually see one. And then once I did see one, that kind of planted the seed that germinated for years, that culminated in a research project to learn as much as I could about them.
Give us a sense of the fish owl and how it differs for all sorts of reasons from other owls which we may be more familiar with.
Sure. Well, in the UK, you have I feel like your viewers and your listeners are more familiar with something about the same size, because you have the Eurasian eagle owl. In the U.S., we have the great horned owl, and a fish owl weighs about 3 times what a great horned owl weighs. But it's just this massive, massive bird. We recently weighed one that exceeded more than 5 kilograms. So this is an eagle-sized owl. 2-meter wingspans, stand at 3/4 of a meter tall. They are just big and they are burly. They don't migrate, so they're really, really, really fluffy. When they have a disheveled appearance. They have these ragged ear tufts. If a gust of wind hits one, it's almost like they're all these mini explosions of fur puffing out. And they spend more time on the ground than most owls. They walk up and down a riverbank looking for a good fishing spot. So they hunch over and, like trolls, patrol these rivers. They're just fascinating birds. I wouldn't call them sleek. I wouldn't call them stealthy. They're lumbering and they're disheveled, and I just love them.
And they don't have to be quite so stealthy as other owls because their prey is underwater, which also, I believe, means that they don't need that sort of disc like face that other owls have for evolutionary reasons.
Right. That's certainly what I and the Russian colleagues that I work with on fish owls have come to believe. I mean, most owls have adaptations in their wings that allow them to fly silently, and fish owls don't have this. And the same, usually most owls, if you think of a barn owl, for example, it's an extremely distinct, almost like a mask, right? This facial mask, and those feathers channel sound directly to the ear holes of the owl. And so they can pinpoint the source of a sound in complete darkness. And fish owls really lack that. And I really do think it's because they're hunting fish, so they're underwater, and the rivers where they hunt are rapidly moving, and they're rocky and they're loud. Whenever we're trying to listen for owls, we're in fish owl habitat, we move away from the river so that we're not bothered by the noise. And so imagine having hypersensitive hearing and sitting next to a loud roaring river. I think you would go crazy from the noise.
So it's salmon that they typically eat. Give us a sense of the territory in which they would live.
So fish owls they live in these river valleys, these broad river valleys, but they stick very close to the waterway itself. So you can have a valley that's maybe 2 kilometers wide. And so some of the results from the research I did with my Russian colleagues that is in the book is we put GPSs on their backs to see where they went. And you can almost, if you didn't have a map, if all you had was points from the GPS, you could almost trace the course of the river just by connecting those dots, because they do not go very far away from the river. So they rely on these, they need old growth trees to nest in. Because these birds are so big and they nest in tree holes, they need to have these trees with, meter and a half, 2 meter diameter. So huge old growth trees. And those are water loving species that only live right next to the river anyway. So they select these places that have these big trees and also open water, unfrozen water in winter. So it gets quite cold in Primoria. It reaches mid -30 Celsius, no problem in winter. Most water freezes when it gets that cold. But Primoria has a number of natural hot springs, radon hot springs specifically, where this natural gas seeps into the waterways and warms the water just slightly, just enough to keep these specific patches of river unfrozen year in and year out. So if you find a place that has unfrozen water with fish in it and these big trees, and you're in Primoria, you're in really good fisheye habitat.
And we must say that you know this, the world knows this because of the research that you did. When you started that research, really you had none of that information. It's what you've gathered as you've gone along. So let me take you right back to the beginning. You've gone to the region. You've got some meetings set up with Sergei, and there are in fact two Sergeis who are really, really crucial and become friends during this whole time. Just tell us about the three phases that you had in mind in order to meet your objective.
Right. So the two Sergeis, Sergei Sormich and Sergei Abdeyuk, have been doing fisheye research together for about a decade up at that point. And there were stories from the literature, Russian scientific literature, even going back to the 1930s, about, oh, I'm in this place, there are big trees, there's water, and there's a fish owl. So there were ideas about what they needed. So for me starting this project, I know nothing about fish owls. And so I needed the first part of the project was a 2-week expedition to really understand what it was like to be a fish owl, get into the mind of a fish owl, understand their habitat, look at a river stretch and decide whether that's a place a fish owl would be or not, for example. And that first part, it turned out to be pretty much wilder than I was expecting. And then part two was kind of going to some sites that one of the Sergei Abdeyuk, had found fish owl sites, places where he knew fish owls were nesting. And to try to build a set of birds that we could try to catch for part 3 of the project, which was catching birds, putting on these GPS transmitters, and then tracking their movements in order to develop this conservation plan to help protect them.
You say that it was wilder than you'd expected, and I must admit I did laugh when you were thinking, well, should I research hooded crane, and you decided no because you didn't really like the habitat. And then of course when you get to the habitat where the fish owls are, it is crazy land. You say there's not much difference between life and death, particularly when you're moving around, and the snowmobiles on occasion didn't behave quite as you might have liked.
Right. I mean, we learned. We essentially flew in by helicopter to this very remote area and had to snowmobile 80 kilometers from one village to the only other village in the area, which is on the coast, and looking for owls all along the way. And Sergei had been there before, but not in winter. And of course, I hadn't been up there at all. And it was pretty dangerous. It was too late in the season for the ice to be perfectly solid. The only transport in that whole area is at the time was by river. In summer, it's by boat up the river. In winter, it's by snowmobile up and down the river. There's not a lot of travel in spring and autumn because of the dangerous conditions of ice. We did a lot of this kind of at the start of spring, where the ice was melting. Huge sections of ice would crack and fall into the water after we'd cross over it. We'd come upon blockages ahead of us where it was open flowing water and we simply could not move forward. So we'd have to get out chainsaws and cut bypasses through the forest to get back to solid ice. And I remember, thinking in retrospect that, good Lord, that was only 2 weeks. And it seemed like a lifetime being up there, just always on edge, always looking for the next danger, because there's no rescue. It's literally the middle of nowhere. And if we had gotten stuck, we'd have to walk out. If we got in trouble, there's no one's coming to help. There's no rescue. So it was an eye-opening experience, for sure, and a pretty remarkable first dip into the Fishelle world.
Yeah, quite literally a dip on occasions. When that icy water comes over the top of your waders, crikey, that is eye-opening. So you are there, and you're a bit of a rookie, let's say, to start with, in terms of that part of the world, or in terms of what you're doing. What was the attitude of the locals to this American pitching up and being interested in fish owls?
Yeah, the reception we got, especially in part one, where we flew into this little hunting village, essentially, 150 people. By this point, I spoke fluent Russian, and I was very familiar with Primoria in general, but I'd never been this far north. It was the northernmost settlement in the province. And for the most part, people viewed my Russian compatriots with as much interest as they did me, because it was someone from outside. And that was just learning about what else is happening in the province. And I might have even been too abstract. In most cases, for them to really understand my value. Whereas people from other parts of Primoria, okay, you're from that city. I know someone from there. How are they doing? Are they dead? What's happening over here? So it was. I'm used to going places in Russia and elsewhere, and people are automatically focusing on me as a foreigner, want to get to know me, want to talk about things. But here it's always like, let's talk to these other guys instead. So that was really interesting.
You got sort of into the culture by one way or another, and there was quite a lot of pressure actually on the vodka side, wasn't there? There was a lot of enthusiasm, particularly actually from one of the field guides who almost insisted. Tell us about the hospitality side and actually the pressure that put on both you and your colleagues.
Yeah, it's funny. I guess I never really thought about it as pressure. It's just part of life, perhaps. There are numerous customs associated with drinking in Russia, and numerous customs associated with meeting a new person and having some kind of let's get to know each other event. And when you're constantly traveling to new places, that just happens a lot. And yeah, so we did it. There's one field assistant that I worked with for a few seasons, who actually didn't drink, but was very insistent on initiating some of these rituals, where he would. One ritual is by and large, once a bottle of vodka is on the table, it doesn't leave the table until it's empty. That's just something that people do. And so there were times where we were ready for a nice quiet night, and he'd come out and put 2 bottles on the table and then walk away because he wasn't going to drink any of it. So yeah, I mean, it's part of life there, part of field work, part of just social customs.
And tell us about the food as well.
Yeah, one benefit of living or traveling to and working in a remote area like that, where there is an abundance of wildlife, is having access to that wildlife as a food source. So we would catch when we in the later stages of the project, we'd get in this truck and be out for up to 6 weeks, and we'd bring this giant sack of potatoes, of rice, of pasta, these enormous wheels of cheese. But then for meat, we'd rely on just fishing ourselves, or running into local hunters who would give us meat or things that they had stored. So it's very healthy living. I mean, if you don't have a chance to reach for a bag of crisps, or if you run out of beer and there's no beer left, you're 100 kilometers from town. That's it. You're gonna drink water, and you're gonna eat meat, and that's so I'd always lose weight. It'd be in really great shape coming back from those trips, because the live, other than occasional excessive drinking, the life was pretty pure. It was really good food coming into the body, a lot of exercise. So boar, deer, salmon, just all kinds of good food.
So you move on from the training phase really into the really important part of locating populations which can then be studied. These birds, these fish owls, they're elusive, aren't they? Not only are they endangered, they are elusive.
Right. They seem to know when a human is approaching, and they don't like to be approached by humans. They tend to flush. We learned that they tend to flush at a distance of about 100, 150 meters, which is pretty remarkable. That's a long distance. And if you're in a dense forest, even in winter when there's no leaves on the trees, there's just a lot of trees between you and a bird, for example. And sometimes all you'd see is this huge flash of brown kind of moving away from you. So it was very difficult to get even close to these birds. But one of the reasons that we were looking for them in winter was because they leave evidence of their presence. They leave these tracks in the snow along the riverbank. If they lose a feather and it's clinging to a tree branch, you can see it in winter. You can't necessarily see it in summer with when there's green foliage. So so we went into the second phase of the project. We left that feeling pretty good. We had about a dozen sites where we're like, okay, there are birds here. We can reach these sites by vehicle. Things are looking good.
So the field guides are absolutely crucial in helping you along the way. And as you say, quite a lot of it is looking for signs, but also listening, of course, to the call. And you weren't aware of what that call sounded like when you first went there. Importantly, it's the duet, isn't it, of the male and the female that actually helped you locate where the owls may actually be.
Right. And so they don't vocalize every night, and we can't really figure out. There are seasons where they tend to vocalize more, so that's not, unfortunately, the best indicator of whether there's a bird there or not, if there's an owl in the area or not. It can be maybe once a week, maybe once every 3 days. So you can spend a lot of time trying to see if there's an owl there, and they could be there. You just don't hear them. But the duet is fascinating, and there are not that many bird species that use a true duet. And these owls do, it's a 4-note call where the male is the first and I don't know if I can do that. I can't do that with my hands. The first and the third notes, and the female is the second and the fourth. So it's like a call and response. And right, and I didn't know what I was listening for, so I heard them. So the Sergei said, ooh, 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 ooh. When a human does that, you don't know. If you don't know what the actual sound is, you don't know how close that is, if it's terrible or if it's close. And they vocalize at a very, very low frequency. So they can be very far away, several kilometers. You can actually hear them, but just slightly. And it's almost like, was that a noise? Was that a bird? Was that something else? It took a while to really key in to their vocalizations.
And there were occasions when actually you or one of your colleagues made those sounds in order to get a sense of where owls might be, and they get really agitated, don't they?
Yeah. So the vocalization that he used was what I call the juvenile shriek, which isn't exclusive to juveniles, as it turns out, but it's sort of like this descending whistle that is actually pretty easy to replicate by humans. I'm a terrible whistler, so I can't do it for you. And that's sort of the noise. It's kind of like a begging noise, or that's what it means. It's a beg. It's an I want food. I want I want to be noticed. And so Sergei, we were trying to figure out if there were owls in a specific territory or not. And so we sat underneath the nest tree, a tree that he had found years earlier, and made this noise, this whistle. And it was instantaneous. These birds were furious that there was, because they live there. They're territorial birds. They know that that they're not making that noise. There's another fish owl at the nest tree, and they were beside themselves with fury. They both came in. So this was spring of 2006. So there was a lot of dense vegetation. So we were kind of hunched down in the foliage, in the bushes underneath the nest tree, with Sergei shrieking, And these birds were moving around us in the canopy, just like looking down, trying to find where we were. And it was hours. And we ended up leaving because we're like, oh, whoa, we this is getting out of hand. These birds are really, really upset. So we left, but we heard them for hours later, still vocalizing and trying to root out the intruder.
You touched on the size of the trees that are needed for a fish owl nest earlier, but there are two types, aren't there? Sometimes it's in the side of the tree, and then sometimes what you call a chimney nest. Tell us about the differences and the advantages.
Yeah, so think about you have a huge tree, and sometimes one of the side branches just these trees get big, they get old, and a branch just breaks off. And so that space, that exposed wood, decays, and so that becomes a cavity. And I call that a side cavity because it's the side of the tree. Whereas the chimney cavity, again, think of this, the same big tree, but in a huge storm. There's seasonal typhoons here where winds can reach near hurricane levels, so quite strong winds, where the entire top of the tree is just snapped off, and so then it looks more like a chimney. And then the wood that decays from the top down. So imagine you're a bird that sits on the nest, starts incubating eggs in early March. And it's cold. It's, again, reaches the mid -30s, and it's snowy. And like, would you rather have no roof above your head or a roof above your head? And that's essentially the difference. So they certainly prefer the side cavities because it creates this little microclimate, and they can be warmer. They're not getting rained on. They're not getting snowed on. But unfortunately, it seems like the chimney cavity type is more common. So there are birds. One of my colleagues, Sergei Surmich, he once watched a female incubating an egg during a blizzard, and by the end, she had, I forget how many centimeters of snow on top of her back, because she just sat there hunched over. All you could see was her tail sticking out from under the snow.
Let's talk about fish owl breeding. Typically in this part of the world, the owls only have one chick, don't they? But across the water in Japan, they have two typically. So why the difference?
Well, it's interesting. So there's thought. There are fewer than 200 individuals in Japan, and thought to be 1,000 or 2,000 in the total population. So mostly they're in Russia. There's a few in Japan, but the Japanese population almost went extinct by the early 1980s. After the war, Hokkaido was really developed. There were Hokkaido Island, where the fish owls are found in Japan. These big trees, the ones that they rely on for nesting, were cut down for paper pulp. A lot of rivers were dammed. A lot of the dams are right at the mouth of the river. So when you're driving along coastal Hokkaido, these beautiful waterfalls that are artificially made, but guess what? Salmon can't get up there. So the rivers look good. It looks like there's a lot of space for fish, but really there's not. The rivers they're ecological dead zones. There's no fish there. And so once the Japanese government understood that these birds were in danger, they started to put up nest boxes for these birds, for them to nest in, and artificially feeding them. So stocking ponds, stocking rivers. And so the sense is that maybe the birds in Japan are being fed more than they should, and they're getting all this fish. So that's why they're having 2 chicks every year, or laying 2 eggs every year. Whereas in Russia, there's 1 chick every other year. So the flip side of that is maybe there's so much fishing pressure in Russia now that they're not living up to their potential. And that's why they typically only raise 1 chick every other year, rather than Japan, which is 2 every year. So, and then that's a line of research that I'm very interested in exploring moving forward.
And we'll come back to the conservation side, which your research leads into in a little while. I wonder, when you count there are lots of firsts in this book. The first time you see the tracks, the first time you see the feather, the nest, and so on. It really is a quest. I wonder, when you count your first time that you properly encountered a fish owl, the encounter that you keep in your brain as this was the magical moment.
Yeah, I think the first one that came to mind, and one that I do return to, was it comes at the start of the second part, where just returned from this don't want to say awful trip, but very exciting trip in the north. Running away from breaking ice, like slogging across slush. To look for this mythical creature, to look for this thing that's only found in these remote places. And then I go down to visit a site where Sergei Surmich had found a nest, and he was there. He had a video camera on this nest. He was recording it, and so a man named Anatolia takes me to this nest. He's like, "Okay, here's the tree. She's there." And I'm like, "Wait, she's there right now." He's like, "Yeah, have a look." So you look up, and there's a cavity, and there's a crack in the trunk, and you can see her yellow eye looking down at me. So I'm meters away from this bird. So I had just spent weeks risking my life to find one of these things, and here I am standing next to a village dump where there's a cow grazing 20 meters away, and here's this Fishelle looking down at me. So that was that's a moment that sticks out, and it also was an early moment that told me that this is a species we can work with. This isn't one of these species that has absolutely no tolerance of humans, and a human looks at it and it goes extinct. This is a bird that is resilient, and if we give it a chance, we can help keep this thing on the planet.
Which brings us very neatly to the start of your research, and having, of course, to trap these fish owls. It's one thing to see it up there and to, they have that eye contact, as it were, but actually you've got to get closer. You've got to put transmitters on them. You've got to tag them in order to do the research, which will help with their conservation. So again, it was kind of trial and error, really, wasn't it, with those traps?
Yes, the first few weeks, especially. This is now, I believe, January of 2007. Where I keep talking about nightmares or disasters in this book, but it was really awful. Because we went over with, no one had really caught an adult Fishelle before, so you don't know what's going to work. Different traps work for different species. Something that works for a golden eagle won't work for a white-tailed sea eagle or whatever. So since no one had really done this, I had consulted with some capture specialists. I brought over a number of components to make different traps. And so we went to these places where we knew there were owls, we knew where they were hunting, we saw their tracks in the snow along these open water holes, and just tried to catch them. And it was a long time before we actually put together some combination of different traps that worked. And and we're living in a tent at this time. The days were probably the -20s, the nights were definitely the -30s, and you're up all night trying to hoping an owl is going to come to your trap. Then you're up all day fiddling with the trap, trying to see what you did wrong. And so it's just this cycle of exhaustion and cold and failure that is not it's not a great combination of experiences to have simultaneously.
So you start with these sort of I think you call them a noose carpet, and work from there. And actually the trial and error works, and you become really experts in this, and other people start to use your method. So what was the method that worked in the end?
Yeah, so the key thing was really bringing the owls somewhere, so some kind of a lure. And so what we decided on as a lure was putting where they're hunting in winter, so this water where they're fishing is only 10, 15, maybe 20 centimeters deep, so very shallow. And so what we did was we put a little mesh box in one of these open patches of water where we knew they hunted, caught a bunch of fish nearby, so relatively small salmon and trout, and filled the box with these things, 20 sometimes. And the second the owls found that, they hit the jackpot. So they would spend all night there eating fish and guarding that location. And then it doesn't really matter what trap you use. Like once you have the lure, they're going to come back. Their guard is going to be down because they found a magic fish box, and that's all they care about. And so that was it. So we could really define where. So we could pick locations that were very safe for capture, so no obstacles nearby. no chance of the owl drowning or hitting a tree. So it was a great method.
So you've got the owl there, but you've got, I mean, how do you pick up a fish owl?
You pick it up quickly, and I think that's the rule for all, certainly for all raptors, is the longer you hesitate, the better strategy you're giving to that raptor on how to get you with its talons. So it's sort of a shock and awe, run up, and just kind of they'll lie down on their backs and kind of get ready to attack you with their talons. And so you run up and swoop, pick them up by their feet and hold them upside down, because birds become disoriented when you hold them upside down. So their wings kind of relax, and you kind of tuck in their wings against your body and hold them. And when you're holding talons and you're holding wings, many birds just give up, because they're like, okay, that's it, I'm done. I can't do anything. And then once they're in hand, then measurements, put on the transmitters, and let them go.
So just tell us what the transmitters and later the data loggers, which you switched to, what was it that you wanted them to transmit back to you?
Right. So these things were, so data loggers are tricky in that they only collect data. So it's like so there's this unit, it's about the size of I guess I don't know how large packs of gum are in the UK, but in the US, but the size of a pack of gum that sits right on the bird's back like a backpack, and just collects 1 to 2 GPS locations a day for about a year, depending on how it's programmed. Then we have to recapture that bird at some point in the future, plug in that unit, and download the data to a computer. And so what we were looking for was to understand where it was going and what in the landscape is important. And I mentioned early on in our discussion how you can almost trace the course of a river from these lines. So right away that told us that how important the rivers really are. So there's not a whole lot of point if we're talking about helping loggers, for example, change their practices to minimize the impact of logging on fish owls. We need to focus right on the waterway. It doesn't matter as much what's happening on the hills or on the edges of the valleys.
But it was also to do with the tributaries, wasn't it? So it's not necessarily just one river. You found that they particularly found parts of the river that they preferred.
Exactly right. It was areas where the main river breaks into multiple channels and then comes back again somewhere else. So it's precisely that spot with all the different types of water. So you have one channel will still be the main channel, which might be deeper and faster flowing than the side channels with maybe the water isn't flowing as well. And what we believe is that that's important for the owls because it's important for the salmon. The salmon are using these different types of water, these different types of river at different stages of their own life cycles. So essentially, the fish owls are just going where the fishing's good when they key in on these areas.
Which of course makes sense. And so once you've got that information, how much have you been able to influence the logging companies and other people who have commercial interests in that region to try to help conserve the species?
Well, it's been pretty remarkable, actually, the response. There's essentially one logging company that works in the whole area, and it has an affiliate that works in just the heart of Fishelle territory. It's a town I mentioned in the book a lot called Amgu. And so the guy who runs the Amgu logging company, he's from there. He was born in Amgu. He hunts. He has a legal hunting land on the edge of Amgu. He fishes there. And so he understands what his company is doing to the forests. He understands how people use these logging roads after he's done. People will go in and poach boar, they'll poach deer, sometimes they'll poach tigers. And so going to someone like that who has a vested interest in the region, it doesn't just look at the region as something to exploit, but as something for to benefit his community, to benefit himself. He wants to protect that. He wants to do his work sustainably. And so saying, okay, look, here's a map, here's a place that fish owls use. Don't put a logging road there. Or over here, here's an area that is this whole river area drainage is really good for fish owls. There's also tigers and bears and boar here. Maybe block off access to that place. We're getting a lot of they're working with us on this. And so every year, since the conclusion of the project, every year we're closing more and more of these logging roads that the logging companies put in and left there, because this is selective logging. They're not going in and cutting down everything. They're going in, cutting down some of the trees, and then plan to come back in 10, 20 years to harvest more. And so what we do is we've identified the areas with highest biodiversity, so fish owls, bears, tigers, and they're using us as to tell us where to block off some of this access, to human access to these forests. So we're really lucky in that I don't think that this can be replicated in many other places in the world, where groups say, hey, this is important for owls, and a logging company says, okay.
That's really interesting. I mean, you say that you went in with realistic, well, sorry, that's me that's saying that it's realistic. You talk about going in with ideas of conservation rather than preservation, and the differences within that. So there has to be that balance with what the humans bring to that ecosystem, which isn't going away, is it?
Right, it's not, and especially in these remoter places. I mean, everyone in these villages relies on the forest for meat. They rely on the ocean and on the river for fish, and they don't want that to go away. And if there are actions that can help them keep that intact, keep that sustainable, they're open to it.
The field guides and some of the other people that you work with there, you became fond of them, and there's a great friendship certainly with some of them. Some of the field guides that you meet, you say that this is a job for them. If they weren't tracking fish owls, there'd be something else that somebody else was providing a grant for, because it becomes a job. But this really is your sort of lifelong passion, isn't it?
It is, and I share that. I would slightly object to the term field guides, because I mean, these are collaborators, and it's not. We're very much equals in this, and so me and both of the Sergeys, this is our passion. We every year we still get out and do some kind of fish owl work. It's grants that I write or Sergey writes. We'll cobble together whatever we can cobble together. We'll go do something, and it's we're both involved in a lot of different kinds of work, but this is our passion, and we keep doing it.
I was thinking more of Shurik, actually, who was fantastically useful to you, because he could, climb a tree and see whether there was a fish owl nest there.
Yeah, Shurik was great. Absolutely. He was very, very nimble. But right, for him, it was definitely just a job. And it didn't matter where he was or what. He's just a professional field assistant, and he goes out and tracks whatever, does whatever. But good person in the field.
And how often do you get back there now?
In a typical year, I go twice a year, usually in autumn, to do more businessy stuff, and then in winter to try to do a little fish owl stuff. So I haven't been there since autumn of 2019.
Because it's interesting to know that, just because at the end of the book there is a little bit of melancholy about will you be able to go back. So it's just wonderful to know that is the case. John, it's been really fantastic to hear this story. It's beautifully, as I say, lyrically written in the book, but really wonderful that we've been able to have this conversation today and share it. I would say thank you to everybody for watching. The book Owls of the Eastern Ice is beautiful. You heard the first sentence. We can't do a blow-by-blow of every sentence through the book, tempting though that may be, but it really is wonderful, and it's available at the Stanfords website, of course. John, we wish the fish owls and everybody, all your colleagues out there in the Russian Far East, all the very best. Thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. This was fun.
That image of the fish owl protecting her egg whilst covered in centimetres of snow has really imprinted on my mind. A fascinating and impassioned conversation there. Thank you, Jonathan and Julia. Well, you heard there how it all began with the gift of a book. Might I suggest that Owls of the Eastern Ice by Jonathan Slaght might well prove a perfect gift for a friend. What a treat to receive through the post from stanfords.co.uk.